Right, there we go. Right, I'll start again. So I'm Colin Talbot. I'm Professor of Government, retired at the University of Manchester. And the aim of these sessions really is to just be able to discuss and answer questions about the way government operates. And I'm hoping to be joined by other government experts. And we've got certainly one other, John Diamond, who's with us today, who knows a fair bit about how government operates, both in the UK and abroad. And I've had some questions sent in. I'm going to keep these sessions, try and keep these sessions to about half an hour or so. Oh, sorry, we've just got somebody else joining us. I think this is another academic, public admin academic from Brazil. Yep. Alcata, hello.
Hello, how are you doing?
Hi,
Nice to
fine,
see
thank you. We're just starting. So I was just saying I've had some questions sent in and I thought I'd kick off with one just to get us going, and then we can just see how the discussion goes, if that's all right. And in fact, this sort of covers two questions. One, Rebecca Payton sent in. I don't think Rebecca's actually with us, is she? No. She said, will the NHS ever be taken seriously enough as a highly valuable and hard to repeat asset and be run by a cross-party entity rather than by the given incumbents in government? And that sort of links to another question in my mind anyway, which was sent in by Stella Quintin. She said, with the current government group of ministers, is the civil service able to function as it does best, or has it been corrupted by incompetence from the top? So I thought I'd just kick off by spending 5 minutes just talking about that, because I think it actually goes to the heart of a lot of issues about how democratic governments operate. And I'm not going to use lots of slides, but I do have one slide I wanted to show you. There it is. Let me just show you this. So I think at the heart of all government and public administration, there's a fundamental contradiction, tension, problem that's dealt with in a number of ways in different governments. And that's, if you're going to have a public administration which is government structures and machinery which is responsive to the political majority, then it has to be responsible to democratically elected politicians. But on the other hand, we also want public services and public administration to be universally accepted. Some of you may have noticed that occasionally over the last few years, we've had various campaign groups that have adopted the slogan, not in my name, meaning government may be there, but it's not doing things that I like it doing. But every day, actually, we want the government to do things in a fair and equal way, regardless of who we voted for. And just to give you a couple of simple examples, we don't want tax inspectors deciding on how much money we pay in taxes, depending on which political party we voted for. And that happens in some countries, so it's not beyond the realms of possibility. Or we don't want judges deciding whether or not we go to jail, depending on which political party we supported. So we do want institutions that are both universally accepted, but are also democratically responsive to elected governments. And that creates a real problem about where you draw the boundaries between those things. And we draw them in very different places in different countries. One way of drawing them is who gets appointed to actually run things. So in the UK, for example, at Westminster government level, there's about 100 ministers that are appointed by the Prime Minister of the day, who in turn is not appointed by, but effectively appointed by Parliament. There's about 100 ministers. There's probably a similar number of special advisors who are political appointees. And there's usually at the moment something like 40 or 50 czars of various sorts who've been put in charge of things, who are neither, they're not actually ministers, or special advisors, but they've been brought in to run particular activities. So people like Dido Harding, for example, who's not a minister, she's not a SPAD either. So we've got about probably 250 people, and the rest of the public administration in Whitehall, it's our neutral civil servants who serve whichever government is elected, including the permanent secretaries in government departments. Now, if you compare that with the other big place that's in the news at the moment, which is the United States, when Joe Biden comes into office in a couple of weeks' time, he appoints about 4,000 political appointees to run the federal government. So in terms of personnel, Britain and America draw the line very differently. There's an awful lot more political appointees at the top of American federal government than there are at the government in Westminster. And there are other governments which are similar to the United States. Israel, for example, virtually everybody at what we would have permanent secretary level is actually a political appointee. And so they all change when the government changes. The other way we do it is by institutional separation. So in the UK, we go from ministerial departments, which are the ones that have a Secretary of State and ministers at the top making the decisions, supposedly, to what are called non-ministerial departments, which are run by civil servants. So the HM Revenue and Customs is a non-ministerial department. It doesn't have a minister directly in charge. Through to quangos, which are quasi-autonomous bodies set up by legislation and run by civil servants or public appointees outside of supposedly outside of the political sphere. And we do that across a range. There's a huge range from, you know, the military and police forces who are meant to be very politically independent for operational decisions, through to departments where there's a great deal of political involvement in the way in which they're run. I mean, the one that I did a lot of work with in the past was the prison service, for example. So that raises a question about, so for something like the NHS, it's largely run by civil servants and other public servants. But should it be on a different basis? Should it be more independent? Would it be better off being something like the sort of status that the BBC's got? Sorry, somebody else was just trying to get in. So I think that's quite interesting because it raises one of the fundamental issues of the tensions in government between people who are politically appointed or politically elected to run government and the people we have as neutral civil servants trying to run government. I don't know if John has some experience of dealing with this. I don't know if you want to say something, John.
Just two quick things, really. I think it's a really good summary, really good exposition. And I think the American example is really instructive, isn't it? Because I think it leads to us sometimes misunderstanding and how we interpret and make sense of what's happening in America. I think the opposite is true. They don't quite understand our system. And I think the issue of the BBC is another very good analogy, because it exemplifies your point about universalism through the kind of the license, but it also represents that idea of a standalone agency, but nonetheless is responsible and accountable in some way to politicians. And I guess part of the interesting discussion, which is prompted by the question, is it's almost like if we get politicians that we don't like, we think we want to change it, don't we? So it's not necessarily a matter of principle, or perhaps what are the principles that underpin the idea that politicians are held accountable and can run the public services. And I guess for me, the issue is about universalism and protection. If you don't have a kind of political line of accountability, then how do you ensure that more vulnerable groups don't get access to the same services? But I think that dilemma or tension of universalism versus accountability is at the heart of this conversation.
Sure. Does anybody else want to come in? Is there any additional questions on that or comments people want to make?
No.
No?
No.
Okay. I would just add a bit. I mean, one of the things about the difference in political culture between the USA and the UK, I mean, most of you are probably aware that things like sheriffs, so local police chiefs, judges, prosecutors, all sorts of people get elected to office in the USA that aren't in the UK. I mean, the thought of electing prosecutors in the UK would be, people would think that was really odd. So it's an interesting issue. The other thing I'd just point out structurally, and this is coming up more and more in UK government, is where services are located, because it's at the moment is a historical accident, the things that happen to be run by central government in Westminster and things that are run by other tiers of government. So now the devolved governments in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, but also local government. And just to give you a very simple example, we have a single national tax collection agency which collects the vast majority of taxes, apart from some small local government taxes. It's all collected through HM Revenue and Customs. If you go to Denmark, all taxes, virtually all taxes, are collected by local government, not by central government. The tax rates are set by central government, but local government actually collects the taxes. And it's one of the reasons that I think Denmark has a far better tax compliance rate than we do, because local officials know their local areas really well, know who's got a big house and looks like they ought to be paying more tax than they're declaring. And that's not the case in this country. And we used to have more localized taxes in the sense that local tax collectors, as they were called, covered a specific geographical area, but it's become less and less the case through HMRC in recent years. So where you set the boundaries also changes enormously between different countries. And there's no particular reason why we should keep some of the structures we got at the moment. At the moment, British central government runs 3 big areas of activity. They run tax collection, benefits payments, and they run the prison service. Now, all 3 of those in other countries are done at different levels of government. So, you know, and it's just an accident that we happen to do them all centrally in the UK. Has anybody got questions they wanted to ask that weren't in my initial couple? I don't think any of you had actually sent in questions, had you?
No.
No?
I sent a question, actually.
You did?
I did.
Right,
Yeah.
Eric, sorry.
I sent a question about
about the Scottish Executive. Yeah, do you want to tell us?
Department of Constitutional Affairs, yes.
Do you want to just tell us what it was?
To summarise my question, sure. I'm aware, and I'm not sure if I used exactly the correct terminology, but I am aware that within the Scottish Executive there is a Department of Constitutional Affairs. And I also read recently that a large proportion of the highest paid civil servants in Scotland are employed in that department. And that strikes me as sort of ethically questionable. But I don't know how to assess this myself. So that's the essence of my question. Obviously, I feel that at the moment, the top civil servants should be directed towards departments focused on the pandemic or some matter of inequality or something else. But I don't know how to assess it.
Right. Yeah. That's an interesting one, because it's really part of a much broader question about politics in Scotland, which is and the sort of debate you get between the SNP and particularly the Conservatives, but Labour also to some extent, which is how far the Scottish government should be concentrating on running public services in Scotland, which they're responsible for the vast majority of public services. There's one or two of the national things like HMRC still responsible for tax collection in Scotland for the vast majority of taxes, and DWP is still responsible for paying out benefits and pensions and so on in Scotland. But apart from that, most things are actually run by the Scottish Government. And there's a political argument about whether or not the Scottish Government should be concentrated on running those services better and delivering, and particularly at the moment, delivering on managing the COVID crisis, or whether or not they should be prioritising independence or getting greater autonomy from the Westminster Government. So to that extent, it's almost inevitable if you've got a government, an SNP government, which is committed to independence, that it's going to want to spend more attention and devote more resources to the constitutional issues and the independence issue than maybe a unionist with a small u government, a Labour government or a Tory government in Scotland would want to do. So to that extent, it's a good example of the public administration actually being politically responsive, in the sense that the SNP is the democratic elected government of Scotland. Their priorities include independence, so they want to devote more resources to looking at the constitutional issues. And I think the only way you'd alter that substantially would be to elect a different government or a coalition government in Scotland. I think that's the reality of the situation. As long as you've got an SNP government, they're going to want to devote resources to that. Now, there are ways of looking at that independently to see whether or not what they're doing is reasonable within those political parameters. So one of the ways of scrutinising it is the scrutiny committees within the Scottish Parliament itself, which can look at those issues and say, is the government devoting too much resources to this particular area of activity? I'm not aware of what's happened around that recently, because I've not done any work in Scotland for a while, but certainly the scrutiny committees used to be fairly effective in terms of challenging the executive over some of the things that they were doing. And the other group of people who can look at it within the governmental structures is Audit Scotland, which is the equivalent of the National Audit Office. And they can look to see whether or not they're providing value for money. So if, as you say, and I don't know whether this is correct or not, if they were, for example, paying civil servants in the Constitutional Affairs Unit, whatever it is, a lot more than other civil servants running bigger services, then Audit Scotland could raise issues about that and say, why is that happening? One important difference about audit institutions to note is that they're, in the UK context, external auditors like Audit Scotland and the National Audit Office are severely constricted in what they can question. So I'm not sure about the terms of reference for Audit Scotland exactly, but I know that the National Audit Office in London is only allowed to question how government do things. They're not allowed to question policy decisions. So they're not allowed to say, you shouldn't be doing that, it's a waste of money. All they can say is, are you doing what you've chosen to do effectively and efficiently? And I suspect Audit Scotland's got the same sort of limitations. Now, it's very different from, for example, in the US, where their equivalent of the National Audit Office, which is called the General Accountability Office, doesn't have that restriction. So it can actually say to federal government, this policy is hopeless. It's not going to achieve even what you want it to achieve. It's a waste of money and you shouldn't be doing it. And that creates a very different relationship between the independent auditors and the politicians from the one that we've got, where the NAO is severely constrained in what it can do. Does that help, Eric?
Yes, I think that's that certainly shows me the checks and balances, the mechanisms which are supposed to exist. So yes, thanks.
Okay, Great, thanks. And anybody else got another question? We've got about 5 minutes left for this session.
I don't know whether this is too big a subject, really. My name's Marie Butler, and I'm just a retired citizen, is what I am, but interested in finding out more about how government works. So I have particular questions and queries about the way laws might change, and what constitutionally, if there is a constitution, because there are, you know, sort of like people who say, well, there is no written constitution, so it's all a matter of convention, and what protections the general public and lawmakers and the judiciary have against lawmakers who probably are stepping over the line. So that's where my concerns are.
That's a really interesting question as well. Late colleague of mine in the United States, a guy called Larry Terry, wrote a very interesting book about the role of civil servants and politicians, in which he calls one of his roles that civil servants ought to fulfill is what he called the conservator role, which was basically keeping politicians honest and making sure they were abiding by the law and what they were allowed to do, and not stepping outside the bounds of that. And that is a very challenging role for public servants to have to carry out, because it's very difficult for unelected bureaucrats to tell elected politicians, no, you can't do that, Minister. Just to give you a very silly anecdotal example of that, back in the 1990s, when I was doing a lot of work with the Home Office and its agencies, I was talking to the then chief executive of the Passports Agency, and he told me a little story about a minister in the then Conservative government he'd been talking to, and the minister had said, and by the way, he said, my passport's coming up for renewal. I wondered if I could get a passport number ending in 007. Which is, you know, it's a very silly little minor bit of corruption, but the chief executive said, no, Minister, of course you can't. We don't do that sort of thing. You know, that's overstepping the mark. And I know that's a very silly example, but that sort of thing happens all the time in government, about ministers wanting to do things which is illegal or outside of the conventions. We go back to your broader point. We don't have a single written constitution in the UK. There are various constitutional documents. The biggest problem, well, there's several problems that presents. Firstly, what is and what isn't constitutional. It's very clear if you look at Germany, for example. Oh, I've got it here. I just got a copy of the German constitution. It's clear that that's the constitutional document. Them's the rules of the game. Same thing in the United States, and you can only change it through very defined procedures. Part of the problem in the UK is because those bits of our constitution which are embedded in law and have been passed by Parliament can be unpassed by Parliament or amended by Parliament with a simple majority, which means if you've got a government with a working majority, it can change the constitution in ways in which in virtually every other developed democracy you couldn't do. You would have to get 2/3 majorities in both houses of Parliament or whatever. You know, there are different mechanisms for doing it, for trying to make sure that just simply winning a majority doesn't mean that you can start changing the basic rules of the game. And that's one of the things that's missing in the UK. And alongside that, we have a relatively weak role for the courts in deciding how you interpret laws, particularly laws about the way in which government and public administration operates. And one of the debates that will be coming up in the next couple of years is that the Conservative government wants to reduce the ability of the courts to do what's called judicial review, which is the courts deciding whether or not ministers have acted rationally and within the law in making decisions which they can make because they are ministers of the Crown. I don't know if John wants to add anything on that.
I think it's a pity that it's 1229, because I think this is a really, really interesting subject, because it really illustrates those things. I like that bit, but I don't like that bit. So there was a time, wasn't there, last year, where the Supreme Court in the UK overturned an action by the government. What they then did was take another vote and did it in a procedural way, which the court had declared it couldn't do. So for a moment, those that supported what the courts ruled were really pleased. It raised a question, which is, where should the political decisions be taken? Yeah. Should they be taken in the parliament or the institution, or should you be reliant on the whim, perhaps, of judges interpreting, in the UK case, something which is to do with precedent and who has the right to tell the Queen what's happening? So it's a very archaic, doesn't feel like 21st century decision making at all. No, and yet exactly. This week in America, the whole argument for the last couple of days has been the protection of the written constitution. Sorry, Colin.
No, it's all right. Mari wanted to come back.
I was just going to say that because it's obviously a very complicated subject and probably deserves more time, I don't know whether it's possible that we can have a session just on this. I don't know. Sure,
I'll try and arrange that, and I'll see if I can get somebody, one of my academic colleagues who's more of a constitutional expert than I am, to join us for a session, because I'm going to try and do these. I mean, I'm going to try and stick to half an hour. I know we could easily go on longer, so that people can drop in more frequently to this, and hopefully we can encourage more people to join in this conversation. So I'm going to do this every Friday from 12 o'clock, and people can send in their own questions. You've got the email address, and encourage others to do the same. So I'll try and do that for a future session, if that's okay, Mari, and hopefully we can have a more in-depth discussion about that.
Good.
What I'd like to do is try and set a topic for each Friday, so that we can say that's what we're going to be discussing for half an hour.
Well, I suppose
once we get this going. Sorry, Paulie,
that particular one that you've just been talking about is separation of powers, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's the real distinction when you look, for example, at the United States. They've drawn their separation of powers and so forth. Well, perhaps no. I mean, they follow separation of powers, but in their administration, they bring things that we would consider administrative into governmental, don't they, and political, like dog wardens, electing dog wardens. but you still have to have that sort of separation of kind of executive and legislative and what am I saying? Judiciary. Yes. So
okay.
it's yeah. Sorry, I didn't explain that very well, but that's
no, that's all right.
It's separation of powers. It's the sort of the nub, and where should you separate the powers? And
yeah, well, let's do that for a future discussion. I mean, just very quickly on that before we go. The issue of separation of powers in the American system, and it's not really separation, it's overlapping powers, because the executive, the Congress and the judiciary all have overlapping powers, and there's a tension between all three of them at different times. The reason for doing that in the American founders' thinking when they set up the American Constitution was precisely to get away from the sort of monarchical system that we have in the UK, which concentrates power in the hands of single individuals. And all that's happened in the UK over the last 300 years is the power of the monarchies devolved to the Prime Minister. And they still have a lot of powers which are, in other countries would be regarded as completely unacceptable. And I'll just finish off with one simple example of that, which goes back to the previous discussions we were having about the way in which things are organised in the UK. And most people are very surprised by this when you explain it to them. Government ministries in the UK have no legal basis, in the sense that there is no piece of legislation which sets up the Foreign Office or the Home Office or the Department of Work and Pensions. Boris Johnson could get out of bed tomorrow morning and decide to, and he's done it recently with the Department for International Development and the Foreign Office, he can get out of bed tomorrow morning and decide to amalgamate those two departments. And he does not need to ask for any legislative permission to do that. He can simply do it as Prime Minister. It does eventually go to Parliament for approval, but it's usually about 6 months to a year after it's happened. And that is incredibly unusual amongst developed democracies. Virtually every other country have a legislative basis for all of their public administration structures. And in some cases, like Germany, it's actually, at least parts of it are built into the constitution. So governments cannot change them at will. So it's a really interesting topic about where you draw these boundaries in order to protect democracy and protect minorities, and make sure that public administration is both democratically accountable and universally accepted, as going back to the original point. So I'm gonna wind up there because we've gone 5 minutes over time. We did start a bit late, but I'm going to try and stick to keeping these sessions to half an hour. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining, and I'll send out something
Colin.
about next week.
Yeah.
And if you want to encourage other people, please do. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
How do you- oh,
So I'm